Establishing central dominion. This pawn opens lines for bishop development and immediate influence over key squares. Initiating a flexible Indian defense, preparing to challenge the center with pieces rather than pawns, a common and robust response. This pawn thrust instantly contests the center and prepares to build a solid pawn structure, potentially leading to a queenside majority. Embracing the Fianchetto allows a flexible kingside defense and prepares for aggressive pawn breaks. Preparing Fianchetto, G3 aims to build a resilient pawn shield and support the bishop's long diagonal eye on the queen side. Developing the bishop to this diagonal immediately challenges white's kingside ambitions. Solidifying the Fianchetto, this bishop now eyes the long diagonal, preparing for central pawns to advance. Securing the king's safety establishes a stable foundation for subsequent piece development and potential counterplay. Fortifying the center and preparing for queenside expansion, this move efficiently develops a piece and reinforces the pawn structure. Solidifying the center with this pawn advance grants black excellent central control, preparing for potential pawn breaks and freeing the bishop on c8. Developing another knight efficiently bolsters control of the central squares and prepares for castling, aiming for harmonious piece deployment. Developing the knight to c6 harmonizes with the pawn chain, preparing to challenge central control and expand black's queenside influence. Pushing the d-pawn creates a pawn chain and stakes a claim in the center, potentially cramping black's knights. Aggressively venturing the knight towards the queenside, this move seeks to disrupt white's central pawn chain and potentially exploit the c3 square. The knight repositions, anticipating a kingside pawn storm or potentially supporting a central breakthrough after clearing the way. Aggressively challenging the center, black initiates a strategic pawn clash, aiming to unravel white's central control and create dynamic play. Clearing the queen's path, this aims to pressure black's central pawns and potentially support a queenside advance. A preemptive strike against white's queenside expansion, preparing for b5 and potential pawn advances. Castling now solidifies the king's safety, preparing for potential central advances and knight maneuvers. Activating the bishop to a promising diagonal, this maneuver aims to disrupt white's central pawn structure and create attacking chances on the kingside. Unlocking the queenside and challenging black's central space, white dramatically alters the pawn structure, aiming for active piece play. Gaining access to the queenside is paramount, with the bishop now poised to challenge white's central control and potentially exploit the open files. Expanding queenside territory, b3 prepares to support the pawn chain and develop the bishop, aiming for long-term positional advantage. Initiating a queenside pawn storm, black seeks to destabilize white's central control and open lines for their pieces. Sharpening pressure on the queenside, this bishop now eyes the long diagonal and supports potential pawn advances. This pawn thrust boldly challenges white's central structure, initiating a pawn race and potentially opening lines for black's pieces. Opening the b-file allows white to exert pressure along that important boundary, potentially disrupting black's queenside structure and creating new attacking avenues. Activating the rook along the open b-file pressures white's queenside pawn structure and prepares for further queenside expansion. Fortifying the queenside pawn chain and preparing to exploit the open b-file for central pressure. Shifting the rook to the fourth rank creates immediate pressure on white's central pawn structure, forcing a reaction and aiming to disrupt white's harmonious development. Undermining black's queenside initiative, this pawn push aims to disrupt the coordination of their pieces and potentially gain central space. Shifting the rook to the open file offers excellent defensive coverage while maintaining attacking potential. Reorganizing the knight to c4 or e3 prepares for a central pawn push and greater piece activity on the kingside. Shifting the queen to an attacking post prepares for a central pawn break or pressure on the queenside. Fortifying the knight's central influence while preparing for future kingside expansion. Shifting the rook to the seventh rank prepares to probe the kingside's defenses and potentially infiltrate white's position. Positioning the bishop here aims to dominate the long diagonal and prepare for an eventual e5 push, while also contesting black's control over the c4 square. Shifting the rook to a more active role on the b-file, this maneuver seeks to challenge white's queenside control and prepare for potential breakthroughs. A defensive gesture, creating space around the king and preventing potential knight invasions on g5 or f5. Sacrificing the rook opens the b-file for a potent counterattack. Reclaiming the open file after that exchange reasserts pressure on black's queenside structure, aiming to exploit any lingering weaknesses. The exchange simplifies to an endgame where black gains a rook on the open b-file, but white's bishop pair might prove decisive. Knight repositions to a more active central square, preparing for a potential queenside pawn advance or supporting a central pawn push. Challenging the queenside pawn chain opens critical diagonals for black's queen. Securing the knight's retreat to a more active central post, preparing for potential pawn pushes. The knight retreats to safety, preparing to redeploy and challenge white's central control. Exchanging bishops simplifies the position, aiming to exploit the king's slightly exposed diagonal. Reclaiming the knight opens up the kingside structure, potentially aiming for a central pawn advance or piece repositioning to challenge white's queenside space. Securing the king's perimeter now allows white to reorient pieces, aiming for a more active central presence or preparing for queenside expansion without immediate kingly concerns. The knight abandons its central post, potentially liberating the bishop for active play. Unleashing the kingside pawn storm, white aims to disrupt black's defensive structure and exploit the open g-file. This pawn push aims to disrupt white's central control and prepare for further activity on the kingside. Unleashing the central pawn storm, white aims to crack open the position and exploit the cramped black pieces. Recentralizing the knight after its excursion, this repositioning prepares to challenge white's initiative on the kingside. Sharpening the pressure on the queenside, this move eyes the weak b7 pawn and aims to gain a foothold. Breaking the pawn chain with f6 unleashes activity on the kingside, but weakens the e6 square. Unleashing the pawn to fracture black's kingside defense and seize central space. Inviting a decisive pawn sacrifice, black aims to unlock the c-file and harass white's queen. Unleashing a bishop sacrifice to shatter black's queenside pawn chain, opening lines for a decisive attack. Repositioning the knight to g7 opens, a pathway for the f-pawn and aims to contest the central advance. Securing the bishop's diagonal, this maneuver aims to activate the piece and potentially exploit the weakened dark squares after its exchange. Shifting the knight to the kingside offers a fresh attacking perspective, potentially creating new tactical avenues against white's somewhat passive setup. Reinforcing the bishop's central influence, this prepares for potential pawn advances and greater kingside control. Repositioning the knight to the g7 square offers improved defensive coverage for the kingside and prepares for potential pawn advances. Unleashing potential on the kingside, this pawn push aims to pry open lines for attacking pieces. Hesitation on the kingside hints at a deeper defensive plan, though this retreat feels a bit passive. Securing the king's defense, this bishop maneuver aims to bolster the pawn front against any immediate pawn breaks or cavalry incursions. Reasserting pressure on the kingside after a period of positional jockeying, the knight seeks to create new attacking avenues. Unleashing the passed pawn's potential, white seeks to crack open the kingside and create immediate attacking chances. Boldly disrupting white's pawn structure, this knight sacrifices its immediate influence for a vital outpost, aiming to dismantle the queenside. Establishing queen dominance on the queenside, preparing to pry open the kingside. Confronting white's advanced pawns, this queen maneuver eyes kingside opportunities. Capturing that knight immediately opens the queenside pawns for a dangerous advance. Securing the central e-file opens avenues for kingside pressure. Targeting the vulnerable king's defense, white maneuvers towards kingside expansion with renewed intent. Opening the queen's path to the kingside signals aggressive intentions, seeking to exploit the momentarily exposed king. Repositioning the knight to c1 aims to free the b-pawn and create a central pawn breakthrough threat. Unlocking the kingside pawn structure invites decisive complications for white's monarch. Shifting the bishop to defend the king's flank, a crucial stabilizing maneuver as the pawn storm approaches. Shifting the queen to d4 probes the queenside pawn structure and prepares for potential harassment of white's kingside. Trading queens here relinquishes central control, potentially opening lines for black's pieces.